The rain had been falling since dawn. On the hills of Okehazama, a young warlord knelt before a small roadside shrine, his armor soaked, his hands steady. Behind him, barely 2,000 soldiers waited in silence. Down in the valley, the army of 20,000 marched beneath rows of towering banners that moved like a great tide of color. By every measure, he should have retreated. By every rule of war, he should have waited for a better day. But Nobunaga didn't see a trap. He saw an opportunity. He rose from the shrine, water streaming off his armor, and spoke quietly. "We attack." His generals stared at him as if the rain had swallowed his reason. Attack? Against the most powerful warlord in the region? With a force that could barely fill a single village. But Nobunaga didn't flinch. He saw what no one else saw. The storm was not a curse. It was a veil. He mounted his horse, lightning flashing across his armor, and in that moment he didn't look like a desperate commander. He looked like a man who had already decided the world would bend. History would one day ask how that young commander could face impossible odds without a tremor of doubt. The answer wouldn't be found on this hill, but in the man he later became. Years later, another hillside burned under his command. Mount Hiei glowed red against the night sky as temples collapsed and sparks drifted like falling stars. The warrior monks who once ruled the mountain were cut down. Civilians fled into the smoke. Entire families vanished in the flames. And at the base of the mountain stood the same man who once prayed at a humble shrine, watching in silence as a sacred world turned to ash. It was after this day that Japan began to call him something new, the Demon King of the Sixth Heaven. A title born not from rumor, but from fear. But this was long before the fire, before fear became his signature, before ambition swallowed mercy. Here, on this rain-soaked hill, he was still just Oda Nobunaga, an untested lord with a reckless mind and an army too small to matter. He lifted his sword, pointed it toward the storm-shrouded valley, and spoke to the men behind him with calm certainty. "Follow me." There were no theatrics, only resolve. And with that single step into the rain, he began the journey that would turn a minor warlord into the most feared man in Japan. He was born into the Oda, a small, fractured clan in the plains of Owari. To powerful neighbors, the Oda were little more than a border nuisance, divided by rival families, weakened by internal grudges, and surrounded by warlords who laughed at their ambitions. Most heirs grew up learning caution. Nobunaga grew up learning defiance. Even as a boy, he was restless and unpredictable. He spent more time running through fields with commoners than learning etiquette, wore loose clothes instead of formal robes, and ignored every rule expected of a noble heir. Servants whispered that he acted more like a troublemaker than the future leader of a clan. But the moment that defined his youth came when his father died. At Oda Nobuhide's funeral, a solemn moment meant to show unity. The teenage Nobunaga arrived late, dressed carelessly, and behaved with shocking irreverence. He tossed incense toward the altar, spoke loudly, and ignored every custom. To the gathered retainers, it wasn't just disrespect. It was proof that the clan's future rested on someone who seemed completely unfit to lead. From that day on, they called him the Fool of Owari. But while others saw recklessness, something else had begun to form beneath the surface, an instinct for power, sharpened by a world that expected him to fail. And the world tested him quickly. With his father gone, rival branches of the Oda clan moved to challenge him. A powerful uncle gathered support to claim leadership, confident the wild teenager could be pushed aside. But Nobunaga didn't hesitate. Instead of negotiating, he struck first. He launched a swift attack, crushed the rebellion, and had his uncle executed. The clan was stunned. The so-called fool had just done what older, more experienced lords had never dared. The laughter around him began to fade. Next came the moment that revealed the second half of his nature, the part that wasn't reckless at all. He accepted a strategic marriage to Nohime, the daughter of Saito Dosan, a powerful warlord, cunning and feared. The union strengthened alliances, consolidated his position, and showed that Nobunaga could be pragmatic when it served his goals. Slowly, those around him began to see a pattern. His unpredictability wasn't aimlessness. It was calculation, a refusal to live by the old rules that kept the Oda weak. He was still rough, still unconventional, still mocked by outsiders. But within the clan, a new attitude was forming. Uncertainty, curiosity, and the first hints of fear. Because beneath the wild exterior was a young warlord who combined two rare traits: the courage to break tradition and the intelligence to build something stronger in its place. He was no longer just the fool of Owari. He was becoming the man who would reshape the destiny of the Oda, and soon, the destiny of Japan itself. By the time Nobunaga reached early adulthood, the world around him had changed, and so had he. The Oda clan was no longer laughing at him. They were watching him carefully. In the years after his father's death, Nobunaga moved with a speed that unsettled both allies and rivals. He swept through Owari, stamping out resistance with a clarity of purpose that startled the older generals who once doubted whether he could even control himself. His younger brother, Nobuyuki, encouraged by ambitious retainers, attempted to challenge his authority. Some believed Nobuyuki's calm, polite manner made him a safer heir. But Nobunaga saw hesitation as a threat. He offered his brother forgiveness after the first rebellion, but when Nobuyuki tried again months later, Nobunaga ended it decisively. The brother who once stood beside him became the first proof that Nobunaga did not tolerate betrayal, not even from family. It was the moment his clan understood that the young lord who laughed at funerals was gone. In his place stood someone who no longer reacted to chaos. He controlled it. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't his ruthlessness. It was how quickly he learned. He studied the politics of the surrounding provinces, noting which lords were overstretched, which castles were vulnerable, and which alliances were hollow performances. He trained his men to move faster, strike harder, and adapt to unfamiliar tactics. Where traditional warlords relied on ceremony and predictable maneuvers, Nobunaga favored surprise, mobility, and aggression. And in the midst of this transformation, he formed a relationship that would reshape Japan's future. His growing alliance with Matsudaira Motoyasu, the young lord who would later be known as Tokugawa Ieyasu. Both men were underestimated. Both had survived childhood hostage situations. Both ruled clans caught between giants. The two recognized something familiar in each other, a shared understanding that the old rules of the Sengoku era were collapsing. Their early coordination in dealing with common threats built a bond that in time would become one of the most important political relationships in Japanese history. As Nobunaga expanded outward, enemy lords began to realize they weren't facing a reckless youth anymore. They were facing a commander who didn't hesitate, didn't follow the expected playbook, and didn't fear anyone. He moved quickly against rival families near Owari, defeating them with a blend of speed and unpredictability. Some castles surrendered before he even arrived, intimidated by reports of his ruthless efficiency. But his rise wasn't just military, it was psychological. His reputation shifted from the fool to something far more unsettling. Whispers spread about his temper, his unpredictability, and the chilling precision with which he eliminated threats. His enemies stopped mocking him. They began to fear him. Yet for all his aggression, Nobunaga held one principle tightly: strike fast, end conflicts quickly, and avoid long, draining wars. He understood better than most that Japan's endless cycle of siege and counter-siege kept all clans weak. So he did what few warlords dared. He looked beyond survival. He looked toward domination. By the late 1550s, Owari was no longer a fragmented province. It was the foundation of a growing power, unified, disciplined, and commanded by a leader who saw opportunities in every direction. And soon, that opportunity would arrive in the form of a massive army marching toward Kyoto, an army led by one of the most powerful men in Japan. Nobunaga's chance to step onto the national stage had finally come. When the Portuguese landed on Japan's shores in 1543, they brought a curiosity no one had seen before, a metal tube that spat fire and death with a pull of the trigger. Most warlords treated the new weapon with cautious interest. Some bought a few for display. Others dismissed them as unreliable in rain, slow to reload, and far too foreign to trust. Nobunaga didn't just trust them. He saw the future in them. He understood instantly that a weapon that could punch through armor, even in the hands of an untrained soldier, would overturn centuries of samurai tradition. The sword was an art. The bow required years of discipline. But a gun? A gun could turn a farmer into a warrior in a month. And that was exactly the kind of disruption Nobunaga loved. He purchased large quantities of Tanegashima muskets, then did what few others bothered to do: he studied them. He tested different powders, experimented with firing rhythms, and drilled his men not as archers or sword fighters, but as coordinated units whose timing mattered more than lineage. Many samurai mocked him. To them, guns were crude, dishonorable, and unworthy of elite warriors. But Nobunaga didn't care about honor. He cared about victory. And he understood something deeper. The clan that mastered firearms would master the century. Yet guns were only part of his transformation. To make his new armies effective, he needed speed, supply, and infrastructure, things Japan's feudal lords often neglected. So he built roads where none existed, connected castle towns with trade routes, and encouraged markets that allowed merchants to move goods quickly. He abolished unnecessary tolls and taxes, allowing supplies to flow across his territories without delay. Armies that once took weeks to mobilize under other lords could march within days under Nobunaga. And then came the refinement of his most important military innovation, the rotating volley. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of firing a single burst and waiting to reload, his musketeers trained to fire in coordinated waves. One line shot. Another stepped forward. Then a third. The enemy would face a wall of uninterrupted fire. He would later use this method to devastating effect at Nagashino. But the foundation was built here, long before the famous battle. To support the growing power of his army, Nobunaga also reimagined castle design. He expanded fortifications into vast complexes with residential, economic, and military layers. He encouraged craftsmen to settle near his strongholds, making them self-sufficient centers of production rather than simple defensive towers. This wasn't just war planning. It was nation-building. Slowly, other warlords realized the truth. Nobunaga was not merely fighting for territory. He was changing the rules of warfare itself. The older generation clung to tradition, convinced that guns were a passing trend and that samurai valor would always dominate the battlefield. But their hesitation cost them dearly. Reports began to circulate about Nobunaga's armies moving faster than scouts predicted, about volleys of gunfire that shattered cavalry charges, and about a new kind of discipline among his ranks that rival commanders couldn't replicate. He had turned chaos into efficiency, and innovation into a weapon. And now, with Owari unified and his armies modernized, he set his sights beyond his borders, toward Kyoto, toward the heart of Japan, toward the enemies who thought him reckless. They still didn't understand the truth. Nothing about Nobunaga's rise was accidental. He was crafting a new Japan, one reform, one army, one innovation at a time. And soon he would test this new power on a target that had stood unchallenged for centuries. By the early 1570s, Nobunaga's rise seemed unstoppable, But one obstacle stood in the path of every warlord who dreamed of ruling Japan: the warrior monks of Mount Hiei. For centuries, the monks of Enryaku-ji had been more than a religious community. They were a political force with their own armies, their own networks, and their own ambitions. They could bless a leader or destroy him. They had toppled governments, burned rival temples, and intimidated emperors. And now they were standing in Nobunaga's way. The monks aligned with his enemies, offered sanctuary to rebels, and used their strategic mountain position to threaten the routes he needed to control Kyoto. To them, Nobunaga wasn't a unifier. He was a danger, a force that ignored the old order they had helped maintain. To Nobunaga, the monks weren't holy men. They were a rival power capable of unraveling everything he had built. The standoff could not last. When diplomacy failed, and the monks continued to support his enemies, Nobunaga made a decision that few could even imagine. He would destroy Mount Hiei. Not challenge or weaken it, but erase it. In the autumn of 1571, his armies surrounded the mountain. What followed became one of the most infamous moments in Japanese history. The assault was swift and overwhelming. Nobunaga's forces pushed up the slopes, torching buildings as they advanced. Temples that had stood for centuries, repositories of art, culture, and scholarship, went up in flames. Warrior monks mounted a fierce defense, but they were no match for Nobunaga's disciplined ranks and relentless advance. But what shocked Japan wasn't the defeat of the monks. It was the scale of the destruction. Civilians who lived near the temple complex fled into the forests and valleys below. Families tried to escape the smoke-filled paths, carrying what little they could. Entire communities were swept aside as the flames roared higher, consuming wooden structures and echoing across Kyoto. Nobunaga did not stop the fire. He did not spare those who begged. To him, hesitation would only bring the cycle of resistance back again. He wanted the mountain broken, not bruised. When the smoke finally thinned, and Ryakuji was gone, the symbol of spiritual authority, the seat of centuries-old power, had been reduced to ash. The country recoiled. Even battle-hardened generals whispered that Nobunaga had crossed a line. Rivals whispered that he was no longer entirely human, that ambition had hollowed something inside him. The destruction was so complete, so stunning, that people struggled to understand how a single man could command such devastation without remorse. And from those whispers came a title Japan had never used for a warlord before: the Demon King of the Sixth Heaven. It was a Buddhist term describing a force that tempted, dominated, and destroyed. Nobunaga embraced it. Not literally, he did not walk around calling himself a demon, but he did not deny it. He did not soften it. He understood its value. Fear was a weapon. Reputation saved battles before they began. Terror was as effective as any army. And after Mount Hiei, every lord in Japan understood the new reality. Oda Nobunaga was not fighting for territory. He was fighting to break the old world so he could build his own. What no one realized yet was how far he was prepared to go. From the early 1570s onward, his pace quickened, not in reckless bursts but in calculated, relentless waves. Every year brought a new campaign, and every campaign reshaped the balance of power. His first major targets were the Asai and Asakura clans, longtime enemies who still believed they could challenge the Oda. The Asai made the mistake of betraying Nobunaga after he supported their rise. For Nobunaga, betrayal wasn't a political inconvenience, it was a personal insult. And he responded with complete annihilation. He marched with his now famous speed, coordinating with Tokugawa Ieyasu to trap the Asai Asakura forces. Outmaneuvered and outgunned, the alliance collapsed. When Nobunaga took their strongholds, he executed not just the leaders, but their entire support networks, eliminating the possibility of revival. It was surgical, ruthless, and effective. With this victory, central Japan began to fall in line. Next were the Iko-ike, fanatic warrior communes inspired by religious unity, not feudal loyalty. They were stubborn, disciplined, and impossible to negotiate with. They had resisted warlords for decades. Nobunaga erased them in a few years. He laid siege to their fortress cities, including the massive Ishiyama Honganji, not with brute strength alone, but with attrition, blockades, and relentless pressure. It wasn't just war. It was a test of wills. And the Uko learned that Nobunaga's will was stronger. While Nobunaga crushed resistance in the west, a new threat grew in the east, the Takeda clan, led by Takeda Katsuyori, the son of the legendary Tiger of Kai. The Takeda cavalry was feared across the country. For generations, no infantry line had withstood their charges. Nobunaga didn't try to match them with swords. He matched them with gunfire. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, Nobunaga deployed his perfected volley fire tactic behind wooden barricades. The Takeda cavalry charged again and again, expecting chaos, expecting fear. What they met instead was rhythm. Gunfire, reload, gunfire, reload. Wave after wave until the cavalry broke, then shattered entirely. When the smoke cleared, the Takeda power was finished. Nagashino wasn't just a victory, it was a declaration that the age of traditional samurai warfare was over. And Nobunaga was the man who ended it. As war reshaped Japan, Nobunaga constructed something that revealed his true ambition: a Zuchi castle, a fortress unlike any before it. It wasn't simply a military base. It was a symbol. A massive multi-level palace rising above Lake Biwa, decorated with gold art and architecture that blended defense with grandeur. He made roads converge around it. He encouraged merchants to settle near it. He created laws to protect trade and punish corruption. Azuchi wasn't built for the old Japan. It was built for the one he intended to create: a centralized nation, a stable economy, a world where loyalty flowed to a single leader, not to a patchwork of squabbling clans. And for a brief moment, it felt achievable. By the late 1570s, Nobunaga controlled more territory than any warlord of his era. Dozens of lords pledged allegiance. Others surrendered at the mere sight of his banners. Tokugawa Ieyasu stood firmly at his side, absorbing lessons Nobunaga didn't realize he was teaching. Among his commanders, one figure stood out for a different reason: Hashiba Hideyoshi, a former peasant who had climbed from servant to commander through sheer talent. In a Japan built on lineage, Nobunaga's willingness to trust a man like Hideyoshi said everything about the new world he was trying to create. Enemies fell before him. Allies followed him. The map bent to him. Japan was closer to unity than at any point in centuries. But with each victory came a shift, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Nobunaga began to demand more. Expect more. Trust less. Ambition, once the engine that drove him, now became the fire that threatened to consume everything around him. And among those feeling the heat was a man who had once admired him, a man who had served loyally, a man who would one day bring all of it crashing down. Akechi Mitsuhide was watching. By the early 1580s, Japan was closer to unity than it had been in centuries, and no one had done more to make that possible than Oda Nobunaga. But as his power expanded, something inside him began to tighten. He had risen from a clan no one respected. He had survived rebellions, assassins, betrayals, and wars against enemies stronger than himself. He had burned mountains, crushed traditions, and rewritten the rules of warfare. He had done the impossible. And sometimes, when a man climbs too high, the world below starts to look unbearably small. Nobunaga's expectations, once demanding, became suffocating. He wanted speed, precision, and absolute loyalty. Mistakes were met not with correction, but with humiliation. Hesitation felt like betrayal. His closest generals, men who had followed him through fire and famine, began to feel the weight of his temper. He shouted more. He trusted less. He tolerated nothing. Some attributed it to exhaustion. Some to the pressure of unifying a fractured country. Some to the loneliness of a man no longer surrounded by equals. But for one retainer, it became something more dangerous. Among the many generals who served Nobunaga, Akechi Mitsuhide was one of the most refined, a man of culture, intellect, and discipline. If Nobunaga was fire, Mitsuhide was water, soft-spoken, educated, composed. He handled negotiations, governed provinces, and fought with the calm steadiness Nobunaga admired, at least at first. But as the campaigns grew harsher and the pressure mounted, Mitsuhide found himself on the receiving end of Nobunaga's sharpest criticisms. Small failures became reasons for public rebuke. Rumors circulated that Nobunaga mocked him behind closed doors. Some sources suggest Nobunaga made jokes at Mitsuhide's expense in front of other generals, humiliating him in ways that wounded deeply. Worse still, Mitsuhide's mother may have suffered during a local uprising sparked by Nobunaga's harsh policies. Whether Nobunaga was directly responsible or simply indifferent to her safety, it left a scar Mitsuhide never forgot. A man who once felt pride in serving Nobunaga began to feel something colder, resentment. But Mitsuhide wasn't the only one. Nobunaga's world depended on loyalty, but loyalty strained under the weight of fear. Some lords feared disappointing him more than they feared losing to him. Others walked on eggshells, praying their decisions wouldn't earn his wrath. Even Tokugawa Ieyasu, his most steadfast ally, observed Nobunaga's temper with quiet caution. Nobunaga's victories had become so absolute that the only battles left were internal ones. Against pride, against paranoia, against the creeping belief that no one around him was worthy of standing at his side. He had climbed too far to see the ground, and too high to see the cracks forming beneath his feet. Azuchi Castle, once a beacon of Nobunaga's ambition, became a symbol of his isolation. He spent long stretches there, issuing commands, planning campaigns, expecting everyone else to keep up with a mind that never slowed. Some nights he was said to walk the corridors in deep thought, wavering between brilliance and frustration. The burden of uniting Japan pressed on him like an invisible weight. He wanted a new world. But he was becoming a man unable to live in any world that wasn't bent entirely to his will. And at the center of this tightening storm stood Akechi Mitsuhide, loyal, wounded, quietly drowning in humiliation. Nobunaga didn't see the danger. He saw a useful subordinate, a pair of steady hands, someone who would execute orders without question. But pride can turn even steady hands into trembling ones. And humiliation, once planted, grows in silence. Nobunaga had spent his entire life defeating enemies he could see. He never looked closely at the one standing right beside him. Soon, the man he trusted to guard the empire would become the one who tore the first brick from its foundation. By 1582, Nobunaga stood on the edge of something no warlord had achieved in generations. One more major campaign, one more decisive push, and Japan might finally bow to a single ruler. He ordered his generals to move. Hashiba Hideyoshi was locked in a brutal struggle against the Mori clan in the west. Nobunaga, confident as ever, decided to send reinforcements. The man he chose to lead them was Akechi Mitsuhide. On the surface, it was an honor. Reinforcing Hideyoshi meant taking part in a major campaign, securing fresh glory for the Oda name. But to Mitsuhide, the order carried a bitter taste. Some accounts suggest Nobunaga had recently humiliated him in front of others, even joking crudely at his expense. Others claim Mitsuhide had lost land and favor due to decisions Nobunaga made without concern for his situation. Whatever the exact mix, the result was clear. Years of loyalty now felt like years of being taken for granted. And when Nobunaga, staying at the Kyoto temple of Honnō-ji, with only a small retinue, laughed off the dangers around him, Mitsuhide saw something he had never seen before: an opening. He gathered his men and began the march, but not toward the Mormon. On the road, he spoke words that would echo through history. The enemy is at Honnō-ji. With that single declaration, the target shifted. The campaign against external enemies became something far more shocking: a march against his own lord. Some of Mitsuhide's men were stunned. Attacking Nobunaga was unthinkable. But others, weary of Nobunaga's temper and endless demands, followed in tense silence. In the dead of night, Mitsuhide's army moved swiftly along the roads Nobunaga himself had improved. The very infrastructure built for unification, now carrying the weight of betrayal. Kyoto slept. Honnō-ji did not. Inside the temple, Nobunaga was relaxed, off the battlefield for once, with only a small guard. He had grown so used to winning that danger felt distant, almost trivial. If he had any lingering doubts about Mitsuhide, he didn't show them. Some say that as Mitsuhide's troops approached the city, a messenger rushed ahead, trying to warn the temple. Others say the warning came too late, that by the time anyone realized what was happening, the compound was already surrounded. Mitsuhide's forces entered Kyoto before dawn, moving with purpose, not chaos. There was no grand speech, no dramatic announcement. Just soldiers, torches, and the quiet understanding that everything they did in the next few hours would change Japan forever. They closed in on Honnō-ji. For Nobunaga, who had spent his life outthinking enemies, there was no clever escape, no sudden reversal, no last-minute reinforcement. The threat he never took seriously was now at his door. And the man he had once trusted to guard his interests was the one leading the attack. Soon, the demon king of the sixth heaven would wake to the sound of gunfire, the crackle of flames, and the realization that the deadliest enemy he had ever faced was not a foreign army, but his own creation. At Honnō-ji, the morning didn't begin with prayers. It began with gunfire. Nobunaga woke to the sound of shouting outside the temple walls. Confused at first, then suddenly, painfully aware. These weren't drunken brawls or street fights. These were organized troops. His troops, or so he had believed. Servants rushed into his chamber, panicked, trying to explain what they'd heard. Some said bandits. Others said rebels. But one name cut through the noise: Mitsuhide. For a brief moment, it must have seemed impossible. Mitsuhide, the careful one. Mitsuhide, the educated one. Mitsuhide, the man who had followed orders without question. Nobunaga didn't waste time arguing with reality. He grabbed his bow and sword and stepped out into the temple grounds. Flames were already starting to creep up the wooden beams as gunshots cracked the morning air. Mitsuhide's forces had the compound surrounded, pressing inward with disciplined precision, the kind of decisiveness Nobunaga might even have admired under different circumstances. Inside, he had only a handful of attendants and guards. Among them was Mori Ranmaru, his young page and trusted companion, known for his devotion and sharp mind. Ranmore had grown up at Nobunaga's side, serving him in everyday duties and standing near him in moments of crisis. Now he stood beside him for the last time. Nobunaga fought as the temple closed in around him, not as a distant commander, but as a warrior. Arrows flew. Steel flashed. The men with him did what they had always done. They followed. But the numbers were hopeless. Nobunaga had spent his life outnumbered and winning. Here, he was outnumbered and cornered. There would be no brilliant maneuver, no reinforcements thundering in at the last second. He understood what that meant. Some accounts say he laughed bitterly at the irony. Others say he grew quiet, accepting the fate that had finally caught up with him. What they all agree on is this: Nobunaga chose not to be taken. He retreated deeper into the temple, away from the open courtyard where enemy soldiers were beginning to push through. The air was thick with smoke. Flames crawled up pillars and raced along the eaves. The floorboards groaned under the heat. With the world he had built burning around him, he made his final decision. Rather than allow Mitsuhide the satisfaction of parading him as a captured prize, Nobunaga prepared to take his own life in the samurai way, denying his enemy the victory of his body, even if he could no longer deny him the victory of his rebellion. Ranmar stayed at his side, helping prepare what was needed, guarding the entrance, buying seconds that mattered. The loyalty that had once been a quiet presence in the background now stood at the center of the scene. Nobunaga, who had crushed mountains and shattered clans, ended his life not on a battlefield commanding thousands, but in a burning temple, surrounded by a few loyal retainers and one page who refused to leave. After Nobunaga's death, Ranmaru followed. He is said to have either taken his own life or died fighting, choosing to fall the same day as his lord, in the same fire that erased everything they had worked for. Outside, Mitsuhide's soldiers closed in fully. Honnō-ji roared as the flames consumed it, sending sparks into the Kyoto sky. Inside the inferno, the story of the Demon King ended. Or so it seemed. Because while the man perished in the fire, the legend of the wild youth from Owari, the innovator, the destroyer of mountains, the unifier who almost was, had only just begun. The temple collapsed. The ashes settled. And somewhere beyond the smoke, another of Nobunaga's generals was already turning his army around, ready to make sure this betrayal would not stand. News of Nobunaga's death spread quickly, shock at first, then calculation. Some lords hesitated, wondering if this was the moment to reclaim independence. Others watched Mitsuhide, waiting to see if he could hold what he'd seized. But one man didn't hesitate at all. Hashiba Hideyoshi, the general Nobunaga had originally ordered Mitsuhide to reinforce, moved faster than anyone expected. When word reached him of the attack at Honnō-ji, he didn't freeze. He pivoted. He made peace with the Mori clan in a rush, securing a truce that freed his hands. Then he turned his army around and marched straight back toward Kyoto with the kind of speed Nobunaga would have approved of. Within days, not months, not years, Hideyoshi confronted Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki. Mitsuhide, who had gambled everything on a single strike, now faced the combined force of Nobunaga's legacy in motion. His men were outnumbered, his support thin, his position unstable. The battle was brief. Mitsuhide's forces broke. He fled, only to be killed soon after, either by bandits or vengeful locals, depending on which version is told. The man who had toppled the Demon King survived just 11 days after his victory. Nobunaga was gone, but the world he had set in motion was still moving. Hideyoshi stepped into the vacuum, gathering Nobunaga's former territories and allies, continuing the work of unification. He lacked Nobunaga's raw edge, but he possessed his own brand of cunning, political, flexible, and deeply pragmatic. He restored order, then extended it. And after Hideyoshi, when the chaos of succession rose again, the lessons Nobunaga had taught on war, power, and central rule finally crystallized under Tokugawa Ieyasu, the ally who had quietly watched, learned, and waited. When the Tokugawa shogunate brought long peace to Japan, its foundations rested on stones Nobunaga had quarried, the roads he built, the castles he reimagined, the enemies he destroyed. The idea that Japan could be more than a patchwork of rival lords, and yet his legacy was never simple. To some, he remains a visionary who dragged Japan toward a new era, a man who saw beyond his time, who broke the chains of tradition so others could build something stronger. To others, he is still the Demon King, the warlord who burned holy mountains, massacred enemies without mercy, and let ambition devour whatever softness he once had. Both images are true. He was the boy who mocked a funeral, the lord who modernized war, the conqueror who almost unified a nation, and the man who died in a fire he didn't start, surrounded by the consequences of the fear he created. Centuries later, Japan remembers him with a mix of awe and unease, and the question he leaves behind is the same one that flickers in the shadows of every great empire. Did Oda Nobunaga build a new world? Or did he only clear the ground for someone else to rule?